Hi, welcome back. I'm Lauren T. Gage, and I'm really glad you're here. Today, what I'm going to be learning and talking about is this book called The Great Taking by David Rogers Webb. If you're interested in this book, you can download a free copy. I'll put the link in the descriptions. It's just online. He's giving his book away for free, working to share his thoughts and his ideas. Also, there's a documentary on YouTube about this with him interviewing David Rogers Webb, and I'll put a link to that as well. I definitely recommend watching those. It's a very interesting book. From what I've seen online, everything about him checks out, and the documents that he refers to, he actually includes in the appendix. So it looks like everything's verifiable. And so I, suggest you read it and look into it for yourself and see what you think. And then let me know in the comments what you think about this great taking. I've been wondering about what everybody's talking about with you'll own nothing and be happy. And I see how I've wondered, how would that be possible? How could they do that and have everybody go along with it or have it actually happen? From what I see in this book, I see how it's possible. The way that our assets are all collateralized and being sold and resold. Basically, everything we own right now is really collateral for somebody else to use. And just like the banks are multiplying our money supply and they just keep relending and relending the same money over and over again, they're doing that with the assets. So we may have some asset of stocks that we think we own, but we don't actually have the certificates to it. We just have an entitlement to the certificate. Or we may think we even own our house. But if we don't have the paper deed to the house, we might just have an entitlement to the house. So all these assets could be being used, and from what it says in here, are being used as collateral, being just multiplied again and again, so that when this money game ends and somebody has to take the collateral to pay off the debts, it's the people who actually have the ownership papers, like we used to have, that will end up holding everything and owning everything. And it will be the great taking because they can take everything in order to pay their debts off because they've been using it as collateral, even if it's been paid off in cash, even if it's our stocks that are in the accounts and we think we own them. We only have entitlements to it. You can read more in this book about this. Prologue, which gives a very interesting and detailed background about David Rogers Webb. Interesting, it tells his history, his personal experiences. One of the things that stood out to me that he says in the prologue is that we are in danger. And I can see that if this were to happen, we are. I don't know if it will happen or not, but from what I'm reading in this book, it looks like everything is set up so that it could. The great taking of all assets that people think they own outright could be very easily taken. The way the debt is set up, the way the structure and laws are set up, and those laws and everything are referred to in this book as well. The introduction goes on to talk about what the great taking is. It includes all financial assets, all money on deposit at banks, all stocks and bonds, and hence all underlying property of all public corporations, including all inventories, plant and equipment, land, mineral deposits, inventions, and intellectual property. Privately owned personal and real property financed with any amount of debt will be similarly taken, as will the assets of privately owned businesses which have been financed with debt. If even partially successful, this will be the greatest conquest and subjugation in world history. And from what I'm seeing as I research this even more, it doesn't necessarily even have to be items that are financed with debt. At first, I thought it would be because the debt, if the dollar collapsed, the debt would be reset, and then the debt would be at a higher amount if they wanted to revalue it, and then they could call the debt if the debt was too high for what the asset was valuing for, because there'd be the deflation in assets. But now I'm seeing that it's because all of the assets are being held as collateral by somebody else, and that collateral has been borrowed against again and again and again, and so it will just be taken. And even though we think we have rights to things, we don't. I've heard some people say if you actually have the paper deeds in your hand, then you would be able to protect your asset. I've seen how it's very hard to actually get paper titles and deeds even to paid off real property. Hard if not impossible. These things are recorded. I don't know how it works. Maybe if you do, you could explain that to me, because that's one of my biggest questions is when you have paid off real estate, how do you get that paper title and deed? And if you don't have the paper title and deed, is it just like when the stocks are being held by a brokerage and you have an entitlement to it, but you don't actually have possession of it, so that is also being sold as collateral somewhere else? How does it work with real estate? And then if you do have that title or deed, I still wonder if there's a way to get around that, because reading through this, the laws in here and how it's written is disturbing. And I'd like to know, if somebody understands this better than I do, I'd love to hear what you're saying, which I imagine there's a lot of people that understand this better than I do. So then David Webb goes on to say that this time what it will take is all of your property, or what you thought was your property. Here is your central bank digital currency deposited on your smartphone so that you can buy milk. So this would be the way to instill and have everybody using a central bank digital currency all of a sudden. Also, I see it as how that central bank digital currency would be an asset-backed currency, because it would be backed by everybody's assets. It wouldn't be like, oh, the gold. It would be everything everywhere backing this digital currency. All of our assets taken and backing the digital currency, and then them giving us basically an allowance with rules over the allowance as to how we get to spend or not spend it. The author's perspective here is that crises do not occur by accident. They are induced intentionally and used to consolidate power and to put in place provisions for measures that will be used later. Chapter 2, Dematerialization. Years ago, we got actual stock certificates when we bought stock. In this chapter, David Webb says, there are now no property rights to securities held in book entry form in any jurisdiction globally. In the grand scheme to confiscate all collateral, dematerialization of securities was the essential first step. The planning and efforts began over half a century ago. It was said that there was a paperwork crisis, for which in the 1960s a Banking and Securities Industry Committee, also known as BASIC, was formed to find a solution for. BASIC's solution was to change the processing of physical stock certificates to book entry transfers using technology. The Depository Trust Company, or DTC, began operations later in 1973, but the stock exchanges had functioned fine through the paper crisis all those years. And so David Webb then tells us that DTC eventually became the model for the Central Securities Depository, CSD, and Central Clearing Counterparty, CCP, the purpose of which will be explained later. Here are some important names mentioned in this chapter that you can see when you read the book yourself. The next chapter, 3, Security Entitlement. This chapter is where David goes over his automobile analogy. You'll see in his documentary, he talks about when he uses this analogy, a lot of people just think, oh no, you're going to take my car. But that wasn't his point. His point is that even assets you have that you've paid for in cash could be taken in the Great Taking. Let's say that you have purchased an automobile for cash. Having no debt against the vehicle, you believe that you now own it outright. Despite that, the auto dealer has been allowed by a newly invented legal concept to treat your car as his asset and to use it as collateral to borrow money for his own purposes. Now the auto dealer has become bankrupt, and your vehicle, along with all of the others sold by the dealer, are seized by certain secured creditors of the dealership, with no judicial review being necessary, as legal certainty was previously established that they have absolute power to take your car in the event of the bankruptcy of the dealer. Now, to be clear, I am not talking about your car. I am illustrating the horror and simplicity of the lie. You are led to believe that you own something, but someone else secretly controls it as collateral, and they have now established legal certainty that they have absolute power to take it immediately in the event of insolvency, and not your insolvency, but insolvency of the people who secretly gave them your property as collateral. It does not seem possible, but this is exactly what has been done with all tradable financial instruments globally. The proof of this is absolutely irrefutable. This is wired to go now. This is where he's talking about the security entitlements, and that we just have an entitlement to our assets, but we don't actually have rights to our assets, and that they are being sold and traded behind our backs without our knowledge, and at any time when this debt bubble pops and these people want to collect the collateral on the debt, they can. He includes a lot of official documentation in the book. If you're more knowledgeable about this, I'd appreciate that you comment and let us know. He further states that essentially all securities owned by the public in custodial accounts, pension plans, and investment funds are now encumbered as collateral, underpinning the derivatives complex, which is so large, an order of magnitude greater than the entire global economy, that there is not enough of anything in the world to back it. The illusion of collateral backing is facilitated by a daisy chain of hypothecation and rehypothecation in which the same underlying client collateral is reused many times over by a series of secured creditors, and so it is these creditors who understand the system who have demanded even more access to client assets as collateral. This is then referred to in the book as the everything bubble. I've listened to other summaries and critiques of this book, which have said that all of this information checks out. David Rogers' Webb checks out, the documents he's referring to and citing and including his book check out. And so I would really like to know, what are your thoughts? Do you see this as possibly happening? Have you read this book? Have you looked into the validity of this information for yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment and let me know. Here's where it goes on to get even more disturbing to me. Another quote from the book: legal certainty has been established that the collateral can be taken immediately and without judicial review by entities described in court documents as the protected class. Even sophisticated professional investors who were assured that their securities are segregated will not be protected. There's a lot more detail in this chapter. It looks like all of these other creditors are protected classes that have priority over us who have just entitlements. It's my understanding, I think, that we show up as an unsecured creditor or last in line for getting our money back. Please check out and watch the documentary and tell me what you think. Chapter 4 is called Harmonization. I found on nyulawglobal.org that harmonization, also called unification or uniformity, is the process of identifying and reconciling differences in legal systems and cultures to create instruments that standardize terms and practices of cross-border trade. So this is that they've made it so the laws will hold up across borders and across countries, so across the whole world. One of many memorable quotes from David Rogers' Webb in the book was this one: where they could not easily change problematic local law in which investors had property rights to securities, they structured around it. This is what lawyers, investment bankers, and apparently government officials are paid to do. This chapter addresses something called legal certainty and the Hague Convention on the law applicable to certain rights in respect of securities held with an intermediary, PRIMA, or the place of the relevant intermediary approach, Euroclear and Clearstream, the European International Central Security Depositories, ICSDs, and several other depositories. So this is going across countries. The local Central Security Depository would have legal authority and broad latitude to pass legal control of customer assets as collateral to the ICSD without knowledge or approval from the account holder. So that's another quote from David. Taken at face value with David Webb's explanations, it is definitely not sounding like a good situation, and more so like our collateral has been sold off without our knowledge and can be taken without our knowledge or permission. What are the derivatives everybody's talking about, and the derivatives that are in this chapter? Derivatives here are being discussed, and David Webb defines derivatives as financial contracts on everything imaginable and even unimaginable for most of us. They may be modeled on real things, but are not the real things themselves. They are untethered from physical reality, but can be used to take real things as collateral. As we'll see, the objective is to utilize all things as collateral, and then to have the real and practical means to take all securities and assets as collateral. Chapter 6, Safe Harbor, for whom and from what? Here, David Webb refers to safe harbor assets as assets that are for secured creditors against claims of customers to their own assets. He goes on to talk about how historically transfers were constructively fraudulent under certain circumstances. But now with these safe harbor provisions, the transfer of customer assets to creditors previously considered to be fraudulent can no longer be challenged. That was exactly the point. Further, it is now quite okay for the transfer of the public's assets to be made free of payment, as there is no requirement to show that reasonably equivalent value was received. He goes on to discuss what happened to the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy during the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis. He says, in the aftermath of the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis, no executive was convicted of a crime for the use and subsequent loss of client assets. Quite to the contrary, the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers was used to establish case law precedent that the protected class of secured creditors have an absolute priority claim to client assets, and that potentially and practically only they will end up with the assets. Chapter 7 is titled Central Clearing Parties. Central clearing parties take on counterparty risk between parties to a transaction and provide clearing and settlement for trades in foreign exchange, securities, options, and most importantly, derivative contracts. If a participant fails, the CCP assumes the obligations of the failed clearing participant. The CCP combines the exposures to all clearing members on its balance sheet. Is there a risk that CCPs might fail? The short answer, I think, to this question is absolutely yes. Near the end of this chapter, David Webb quotes the New York Fed as saying, "An investor is always vulnerable to a securities intermediary that does not itself have interest in a financial asset sufficient to cover all of the securities entitlements that it has created in that financial asset. If the secured creditor has control over the financial asset, it will have priority over entitlement holders. If the securities intermediary is a clearing corporation, the claims of its creditors have priority over the claims of entitlement holders." Conclusion from this follows as, so there we have it. In the collapse of the clearing subsidiaries of DTCC, it is the secured creditors who will take the assets of the entitlement holders. This is where it is going. It is designed to happen suddenly and on a vast scale. Do you think this will happen? Please comment and let me know, and share with us any thoughts or information or knowledge you might have about this, so that we can start gaining a better understanding for what's going on and what we should do. Chapter 8 is titled Bank Holiday. In this chapter, we're taken back to the Great Depression, and how for so many people it was an unexpected and sudden financial crisis. He explains how people lost their money, but their debts were maintained by the selected banks, the banks that were selected to survive. People with money in banks that were not allowed to reopen lost all of it. Their debts were not canceled. Of course, that was currency, right? Their debts were not canceled, however. These were taken over by the banks selected by the Federal Reserve System. If these people could not make their debt payments, which was now likely since they had lost their cash, they lost everything they had financed with any amount of debt, e.g., their house, their car, and their business. David Webb goes on to say that what happened here, it was deliberate. strategy. It was about ultimate complete power, allowing no centers of resistance, and so it was about deprivation. It was about subjugation, and it still is, in more ways than we know. It was not about helping people then, and it's not about helping people now. It is all part of the same deliberate hurting of humanity and elimination of any pockets of resilience which plagues us still. What about gold? David Webb says this about the gold confiscation required at the time from Executive Order 6102. Apparently, all the U.S. public was now the enemy. Think about this. People who were simply protecting themselves and their families from the actions of the Federal Reserve System were accused of hoarding gold and literally criminalized if they persisted in doing so. The rationale is incredible. You are hoarding gold, so we will take it and do what with it? Hoard it. As we have seen, once they had taken the gold of the public, they did not then use the resource to expand credit. People remained in a debt trap. The deprivation continued and even worsened. Clearly, the need to expand credit served only as a pretext for the confiscation of the public's gold, which was the real premeditated objective. If you follow along in the book, at the bottom of page 50, David Webb quotes an excerpt from an article by A. Goodman. Bank of America dumped $75 trillion in derivatives on U.S. taxpayers with federal approval from 2011. David Webb says, keep in mind when you see the scale of the derivative positions in these individual banks that the size of the entire global economy was about $74 trillion in 2011. So individual banks had derivative books the size of the entire global economy, and they moved them into their deposit-taking subsidiaries with the approval of the Fed. Why has this been tested on such a large scale? It seems they are quite serious about something. Is the intent to make the deposit-taking subsidiaries safer? What is the real purpose? Used at the appropriate time, this will assure the collapse of the deposit-taking subsidiaries of the too big to fail banks, allowing the taking of money comprehensively, including from depositors in these deposit-taking subsidiaries, leaving essentially no money anywhere and no pockets of resilience or of potential resistance. Meanwhile, in the chaos of the ensuing global wave of insolvencies, peppered with contrived existential threats, the protected class of bank holding companies and their subsidiaries designed for continuance will not only survive, but thrive, taking essentially all collateral. This will be put forth as an imperative, i.e., that they must survive and be strong for the sake of humanity, so that the system might begin again and we all might move forward. People will be desperate and simply want the terror to stop. Further, the Deposit Insurance Fund, DIF, of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was $128.2 billion as of December 31st, 2022. The FDIC is required to fund the DIF to 1.35% of insured deposits. The DIF can be exhausted, and indeed has been totally depleted twice, in the savings and loan crisis and the global financial crisis. In these instances, the FDIC was allowed to borrow funds from the Federal Financing Bank. The FDIC has a line of credit with the Treasury for up to $100 billion. If this credit line were fully utilized, total resources would be $228 billion, roughly 2% of insured deposits. So if the entire banking system is insolvent, insured depositors get 2 cents on the dollar. That will not go far in a widespread banking crisis, or if the deposit-taking subsidiary of a major bank is bankrupted, e.g. Bank of America and JP Morgan have over $2 trillion and $2.5 trillion in deposits, respectively. What are your thoughts on this so far? Please comment and let me know. At this point, central bank digital currencies are discussed. With CBDCs, every transaction can be traced and can be subject to approval, denial, limitations, etc. David Rogers Webb quotes Segustin Karstens, the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements, and what he said in a virtual meeting titled Cross-Border Payments, A Vision for the Future. We don't know who's using a $100 bill today, and we don't know who's using a $1,000 peso bill today. The key difference with the CBDC is the central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability, and also we will have the technology to enforce that. This becomes nightmarish in my opinion. David then writes, in other words, CBDC means absolute control. And so if the old money system somehow collapses, new money will be provided by the central banks in the form of central bank digital currency, the new and improved control system. Imagine, it is chaos. You have lost everything but your smartphone. If you don't have one, don't worry, you will be issued one. You will download an app. You will click boxes agreeing to everything. You will become increasingly indebted with each payment you make using the CBDC you are given on your phone. You will be told what to do and what not to do from then on. You will comply if you want to eat. Chapter 9, The Great Deflation. Here we're given another more personal narrative and more history from the author, along with the consideration that the inflation we are now seeing is not due to strength in the global economy. The underlying intractable problem of our time is not inflation, but deflation. The inflation is illusory. It is created by massive devaluation of money and artificial scarcity. The chapter ends with the Great Reset is anti-human. It is intended to fix in place a system something like feudalism in perpetuity, in which the populace is held in a state of deprivation and fear with the empty promise of safety. Wake up! We have been living within a protection racket in which the protectors terrorize the protected. Those supposedly protecting us from the bad guys are the bad guys. Chapter 10 is the conclusion. Here, David Rogers Webb begins the final chapter with a quote from the Tyndale Bible. Let every soul submit himself unto the authority of the higher powers. There is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. David Webb says, there has been abundant evidence of great evil at work in the world, throughout time and in our present time. Do you really wish to be ignorant of its existence and operation? I'd say this is a very powerfully written conclusion. Please let me know if you've read this book or you plan to and what your thoughts are on it. The appendix includes documents that were referenced in the book, and there is a large and extensive references section. I recommend you reading the book and watching the documentary for The Great Taking, the book by David Rogers Webb. I've put both links in the description below. Please let me know if you've read this book or plan on reading it and what your thoughts are, if you think it's likely to happen or not, and what we can do either way. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you watching and learning with me, and I hope to see you next time.